Kid, mind if I take a swig of milk?
Knock yourself out.
Ulcers. All I do these days is drink fucking milk.
My heart bleeds.
Yeah, well, so do my ulcers, you punk bastard. What the goddamn hell's this about? There's easier ways to commit suicide, you know.
There's a dead man downstairs who found a harder way.
Louis? If you killed Louis, so help me.
Campagna's okay. He'll have a headache to make a hangover seem like Christmas, but he's okay. Fatso, too.
Then who?
A blonde guy. I don't know his name, but I've seen him around.
Have you?
Last time was at Bayfront Park when you sent him to help kill Cermak. Time before that, I saw him running down Randall.
Do say is I didn't send him to kill you.
He pushed me off a skyride tower tonight, Frank. And you know I really don't like heights. I should be a twisted sack of bones and meat on a morgue tray about now, but somehow I'm not. I'm here. He's dead, and so are you. So are you, Nitty. I wish to Christ Lang had killed you that afternoon. I wish to Christ I didn't make them call an ambulance for you.
Heller, I didn't send him. I didn't even know the bastard was in town. He doesn't work for me.
He doesn't work for anybody now.
Something you aren't at all aware of. Why am I not already dead?
The silenced automatic in my hand raised to aim itself at his forehead.
You are dead. Fuck you.
Wait, just wait. Lower that goddamn thing, will you? Just hear me out. I didn't say he never done work for me. He's a guy Johnny Torrillo recommended to Al back on the Lingle deal. I used him later myself. Used him now and then on ticklish matters.
Oh, is that what I am? A ticklish matter?
Kid, I know how you feel. I know the kind of emotions you got running wild in you. I know all there is to know about revenge. You could ask 10% Tony if he wasn't in hell. But I didn't hire a contract on you. I swear by all that's holy.
And I'm supposed to believe that because of all the Catholic shit on the walls? Who sent him then, Frank?
I don't know the answer to that. Not for sure. But I can figure it out, and so can you, if you try.
I was getting confused, starting to wonder what the hell I was doing.
Although edited for television, tonight's thriller contains scenes of suspense and violence which may be unsuitable for young viewers. Parental discretion is advised.
Observations with Robert Burnett.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your sommelier of sci-fi and cinema, your evangelist of the imagination, and of course, the perhaps never to be defined existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, me, Robert Meyer Burnett. I'm once again Robcasting you from the Robservatory. You imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. This is Robservations episode 1041. First of all, being that it is Father's Day, I thought that I would start with a letter sent to me from a viewer, and this comes from Oscar Herrera. Good evening, Rob. I hope this email finds you well. In honor of Father's Day, I wrote a short piece reflecting on fatherhood through the lens of fandom, which can be found at the following Medium link. If it's not too late for a Robservation, it would be an honor for you to share it with your audience. If it is too late, then I hope you enjoy it as a short personal read. Thank you for all you do for the community. Well, Oscar, it is not too late. It is, in fact, Father's Day. This is on Medium. I didn't have time to put it into the show, but it's by Oscar Herrera, and it is entitled "The Man Before the Cape: What Superman Taught Me About Being a Father." This Father's Day is different. It's the first one where I'm on the receiving end. This past August, I became a father to a beautiful baby boy. The best thing that's ever happened to me. And in a beautiful twist of fate, I also stepped into the lives of 3 equally wonderful girls who now call me Dad. I'd be lying if I said the day didn't come with complexity. I've always had a complicated relationship with Father's Day because of my relationship with my own father. He was often absent, and when he was present, it wasn't the kind of presence that made a difference. I used to envy my friends who had the kind of dads who coached their games or simply showed up. Still, I did learn something from him. I learned that a man should provide, materially, yes, but more than that. He should provide consistency. He did gift me one other lasting legacy, a love of superheroes. He brought home toys, comics, worlds filled with DC and Marvel characters, and through these stories I started to understand different models of manhood. As a child, Batman was the coolest. As a teen, socially awkward and anxious, I found kinship in Spider-Man. But it was as a young adult, stepping into the uncertain world beyond school and structure, that Superman began to make sense. The character of Superman has always been present in my life. I remember watching Christopher Reeve's portrayal with my cousin, Brandon Routh's with my brothers, but it was Henry Cavill's Superman that struck a chord with me when I needed it the most. In Man of Steel, Superman isn't just a hero. He's a man wrestling with potential, burdened by expectations, and shaped by the conflicting guidance of two fathers. Jor-El sends his son to Earth not to rule it, but to inspire it. He calls him to be a symbol, an ideal to strive toward. Meanwhile, Jonathan Kent struggles with what it means to raise a child who could change the world. He wants to protect Clark from a world that might not be ready. I watched that film at a time when I was just beginning to enter the world myself. I didn't have powers, but I had potential. And like Clark, I didn't fully know what to do with it. Now, years later, fatherhood is no longer theoretical. It's real and humbling. What surprised me the most is that children don't need your power. They don't need super speed or the ability to solve anything. They need your presence. I remember when my son was admitted to the hospital for a week. I was anxious, scared, desperate to fix something, but the doctors and nurses told me the same thing over and over again. Just be there. That was hard for me. I'm a problem solver by nature, but in that moment, I learned that presence is sometimes the most powerful thing you can give a child. That same lesson is present in Superman and Lois, where Tyler Hoechlin's Superman is more than just a global protector. He's a dad trying to figure it out like the rest of us. He's vulnerable, imperfect, and constantly learning how to connect with his sons. His portrayal reminds me that some problems can't be leaped over in a single bound. Some challenges require not strength, but stillness, listening, patience, love. Superman isn't good because of the super. He's good because of the man. That line has never felt more true than now. I've come to realize that my greatest responsibility isn't to raise high achievers or extraordinary people. It's to raise good ones. I want my children to grow up to be kind, thoughtful, disciplined, and honest. I don't care what they choose to do for work. I care about who they are when no one's watching. Each of them carries a spark, a potential for good, and in turn their goodness inspires me to be better, stronger, not in muscle, but in character. Like Clark, I'm learning that strength isn't found in control, but in vulnerability, in accepting that I can't always protect them from everything, but I can walk with them through it. I remember a quote that's often attributed to the Superman mythos. Superman is what I do. Clark is who I am. That's what I hope to teach my kids, that being yourself with courage, compassion, and conviction is the real power, that goodness isn't just a trait, it's a legacy. This Father's Day, I'm not celebrating perfection. I'm celebrating growth. I'm reflecting on the strange and wonderful journey that brought me here. A boy without a father figure becoming a father to 4. And I'm grateful that through stories, especially the story of Superman, I've found models to guide me. Jonathan Kent once said, "You have to decide what kind of man you want to grow up to be." I've decided. I want to be present. I want to be kind. I want to raise children who will one day be forces for good in a world that desperately needs them. And if the Man of Steel shared in my struggles, maybe I'm doing okay. That was by Oscar Herrera, a member of the Post-Geek Singularity community. Oscar, it was my honor to have you send me that letter and send me to your link to Medium to read this today. My father's been gone since 2006, so really nice to hear from you, and what a great sentiment. So thank you very much for sending that in. Now, this entire, I got to tell you, I wasn't necessarily going to do a Robservations tonight. You know, I'm subscribed to a WhatsApp link where these people are sending me not daily, up to the minute messages of what's going on in Israel, and I've kind of been obsessed by that. But I figured, you know, I could use a pick me up. But I read a comment on my recent Robservations show about a sense of wonder. Actually, I got a letter I'm going to read about that later, but there was a comment that was left on this, and I have to say, I am fascinated by fandom. I've been a part of fandom since I was a little kid. You know, I was going to conventions when I was in elementary school, different events in the Seattle area that was happening at the time. Seattle had what was recognized as the largest Star Trek fan community, I guess organized fan community at the time. And while I do remember reading this in other venues, maybe I'm also looking back on this with rose-colored glasses, but it was called the PSST because Seattle is on Puget Sound, which is an inlet from the Pacific Ocean. And the PSST were the Puget Sound Star Trekkers. And they had a logo where the PSS and the T formed the profile of the Starship Enterprise, which I always thought was very, very cool. So I've been involved in fan circles literally my whole life. And one of the things that was apparent to me, and I've tried to impart this on the show for the last 6+ years, is that I knew that I was coming into a fandom that already existed. And I was waxing rhapsodic the other day about how, for instance, I was discovering things like The Twilight Zone and Star Trek and War of the Worlds, which came out in 1953, a decade and a half before I was born. I was finding things in the past that were already made that I loved. And then as I started to read the science fiction classics, reading Professor Tolkien's work, this was material that was made long before I was around. So I knew that the things that I loved, especially genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and horror in all of its myriad forms, which, by the way, led me to a love of storytelling in general. It's funny because, ironically, most of my favorite movies are not genre films at all. Storytelling is uniquely about people, and I find myself drawn more towards movies about people than I do, and those are, quote, set in the real world, as opposed to being fantastical. But I always knew that there was a past that already existed, and that meant that I was never at a loss to find something new, to delve into, to experience, to figure out, okay, we got here because of this, you know. And I remember Colossus, the Forbin Project. I remember watching that movie on TV, and it was a fairly sophisticated movie, really, for what I was used to, and finding out it was based on a trilogy of books, and one of them was called Colossus and the Crab. And what's that about? You know, so there was always something to delve into. I was never a presentist, meaning that what was going on right in front of me now, I knew that what I was watching was part of a continuum, a pantheon of works that were constantly being added to, and I didn't grow up with any kind of prejudice against things that were old. I never understood that. Like, part of the appeal, and I've said this a million times on the show, of like the Universal horror films, was that they were made in the 30s. You know, they were made when cinema was new. Sound was less than a decade old when we got Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein and Bela Lugosi's Dracula, both the English language and Spanish versions. And that was fascinating to me. And the thing was, the way they were made, the way they felt, were of their time, and that to me also was appealing. Like, I wasn't alive when these movies were made, and the way they were made, the way people talked, the way the films were shot, was from a time that I wasn't a part of. So getting a window into the world when these things were made was also very interesting to me. It was part of the appeal, and I loved I loved hearing about how these things were made. Like, what had James Whale done before? How were the sets built? You know, and that's what it was all part of the appeal. So anyway, there was a comment. I was talking on the show the other night about Star Wars. Go figure. But somebody brought up about in The Empire Strikes Back how when we first meet Yoda, we're not supposed to know who he is. When The Empire Strikes Back was made, when Irvin Kershner directed it and Lee Brackett was rewritten by Lawrence Kasdan, when that script was made, the character of Yoda was both they were tricking the audience and Luke at the same time. We, just like Luke in the movie, were supposed to misjudge. We misjudged Yoda because we've heard, you know, you will go to Dagobah and find the Jedi Master Yoda who instructed me. You know, Ben Kenobi set Luke out on this quest. Now, Yoda had not been brought up, nor had Jedi Masters, you know, up until the beginning of Dagobah when Luke was hallucinating after he got out of the Wampa's clutches. And so when we, the audience, is intentionally meant to be set up to, when we first meet Yoda, we can't possibly believe that toad-like little creature is a Jedi Master. And that was the entire point of his character, is that Luke misjudged him and we misjudged him. That's a huge plot point. Not only is it a huge plot point, as an audience experiencing The Empire Strikes Back 45 years ago for the first time, it was a delightful surprise. The way Frank Oz performed Yoda, and then, as I talked about the other night, when he dropped his voice, I cannot teach him, you know, and then you see Luke, it dawns on him that Yoda is Yoda, you know, and then Yoda kind of stands up and puts his chin up, you know, his posture gets better. And we see Yoda go from a toad to a Jedi Master in a magical moment. Now, the point that we were making, that the viewer was making who had commented, and the point that I made, is that because George Lucas chose to go and make the prequel trilogy, and he chose to delve into the pasts of these characters, especially Master Yoda, if you now watch the Star Wars movies in chronological order, much of the magic of The Empire Strikes Back, of what it was like to view that movie for the first time, and what some of the messages, what the story was telling you, have been destroyed. And that moment is one of them. I mean, in a way, it never really occurred to me, to believe it or not, until the show the other night. And I'm like, because I've told people I saw Empire Strikes Back 26 times in the theater when it first was released, the summer of 1980. Sat in the same seat every time at the UA 150 Theater. Rest in peace. But that was part of the appeal of that film, is that the entire experience of Yoda, we were constantly underestimating him. You know, I don't believe it. That is why you fail. I mean, you know, that's not very good Yoda, but, you know, that was the point of that character. Well, this was a surprising comment to read. And it said a lot of things, and it made me think about the topic for tonight's show. And this comes from Atavius, or Atavious. Tavius, 2491. Here's the comment. I'm a prequel fan. Destroyed the OG movies and its surprises are subjective in my point of view. But the thing is, that's not subjective. It's objective. Watching everything chronologically recontextualizes the story of Luke Skywalker, where Luke isn't aware of the things that happened before his birth. He wasn't aware of them when we first saw Star Wars. We, the audience, know, yes, but the OG episodes serve as an arc where now the son has to inevitably discover who his father and the Jedi really are in order to save it and start a new era of peace after Episode 6. I'm sure that the OG movies might have felt different when they were first released long before the prequels, but I'm of a different generation, with my own perceptions and ideas, and I just disagree with this original fans only mindset. Someone who grew up and has had a preference of Star Wars based on the prequels. No one wants to admit that Star Wars is an ever-changing thing, and what we once thought of the franchise, given a certain time period in the past, is not going to be the same in the future. I'm so sick of listening to OG fans who still hang around telling prequel fans and other fans that they're factually wrong for liking the prequels. Look, I love the original movies too, like any Star Wars fan, but I'm sorry. I find Anakin's fall to the dark side to be a lot stronger than his comeback in Return of the Jedi. I've seen a lot of polls done on the current state of the franchise and video discussions, and it's very clear that prequel fans are becoming the new dominant voices of this franchise. There have since been a lot of expanded material of the prequels, both canon and legends, that explains how they tie into the originals. And I'm also sick of people antagonizing George Lucas for wanting to tell the story and expressing the art he wanted to tell. I find this podcast to be definitely just for Gen X mindsets who only care about pop culture pre-9/11 or modern entertainment that adapts works from older generations. I feel as if the 2000s, 2010 kids like me are not welcome here with the pop culture we value in the early 21st century. Well, first of all, totally understand what you're saying. The thing is, you're wrong. And that's something I think it's one of the hard lessons to learn. You don't, because you like something, we now live in a world where everybody, maybe it's because every kid gets a trophy, that everybody's opinion carries equal weight. And I don't think that's necessarily true. You see, if you're a Star Wars fan, and I don't mean to slag off on you, but you did kind of take a few shots at me personally on this show. And first of all, I would say this is all inclusive. But you know what this show has that no other show on YouTube has? Me. It has my opinions and my, whether you like me or not, I am not everybody's jar of jam, certainly. And if I am everybody's jar of jam, maybe I wasn't, vacuum packed hard enough. So when you took me out of the closet and opened me up, I wasn't exactly your flavor. I don't know. But I don't even know if that was a great analogy. I've never made that analogy ever in my life. But there you go. See, it just happens. It's stream of consciousness here on this show. But the thing is, I'm not here to tell you whether you're right or wrong. I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should or shouldn't like something. I'm the first person to say you should like what you want to like. But the problem that I have now is that no one is bothering to learn what came before. And that's what I object to. For instance, when Superman was created, he could not fly. When Superman was created, he was able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. He was more powerful than a locomotive. At the time, because pop culture was constrained by belief. Now, as the mythology of Superman has been created since the 30s, there's a lot of things that, hey, we didn't have. Things have come and gone. Crypto was removed from continuity after existing since the 50s. Otto Binder? And they took him out. They took crypto out after Crisis on Infinite Earths because the DC universe, they wanted to get more serious and appeal to a more adult audience. But in the case of Star Wars, here's what I would say to you. It's always important to go back and understand first principles. If you love something, for instance, as a Star Trek fan, one of the things that's built into Star Trek fandom, which is interesting today, is Star Trek fans knew, because it was a big thing that made Star Trek unique, is that the first pilot for Star Trek, The Cage, that was about Captain Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter, and Number One, who was a female first officer, and Spock, who was the science officer, that first pilot was rejected by the network. They thought it was too cerebral. They didn't like necessarily Jeffrey Hunter as the lead. He was a little too serious. And so that was put away. And they made another pilot, which was where no one has gone before, where no man has gone before. And what was interesting about that is then, to save money, because Star Trek was indeed, people think it wasn't, but it was an expensive show, they used the original pilot in a genius move, and they incorporated into the two-part episode The Menagerie from the first season of Star Trek. And by doing that, They inadvertently created Star Trek canon. They gave Star Trek its own history from 11 years prior to when Star Trek began. And they gave us a very intriguing taste because the set design was a little different. Things were changed. Even the Enterprise had been updated. The exterior of the Enterprise had been updated since the original pilot. So suddenly you had history. Now, as a Star Wars fan, I understand, like James Bond, whenever you come to the franchise, you know, that's the Star Wars for you. But when I say something like on the show, or when a viewer writes in and says, listen, you know, my friends, or we were talking and they didn't even realize that Yoda, you weren't supposed to know who Yoda was. And the thing is, you weren't. And I think, and also, you weren't supposed to know that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. This was a huge, shocking revelation. Now, you can say that it hits you differently now when you already know that, but I would say the way that the story unfolds in The Empire Strikes Back, you weren't supposed to know those things. If episodes 1, 2, and 3 had been made before, The Empire Strikes Back would very much look different than it does now. And going back and watching the original trilogy, I think the prequels have... Look, you can love the prequels all you want, but I think it's generally considered that... Another problem is, the prequels are just not great movies. They might have great stuff in them, and I think they tell a great story ultimately, but not very well. And I think part of it is the technology that they were using. You can hear Ewan McGregor, look him up, speaking on YouTube, saying he really didn't know what he was doing when he was making Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, because most of what they were shooting was on green screen. He talks about how, you know, I'm going to Camino to meet the cloners, and he was just wandering around on a green screen stage looking at things. So part of the problem with the movies is the human beings in those films. They don't feel like they're really there. The performances are very stilted because the actors themselves were not acting. I mean, the whole green screen phenomenon, it was one of the earliest movies where that was employed to that extent. So actors had a really hard time understanding how and where, how they were supposed to sound and where they actually were. And an actor's lost when they're like that. One of the things about the volume stage, that when you have the LED boards and you can actually see where you're supposed to be, it helps an actor understand the environment they're in. But anyway, so here's the thing. Not everything is equal. You know, mankind, human beings, are born equal. But as we get older, we realize we all, like they say in Star Trek II, we all have our own gifts. Some people are taller, some people are shorter, some people are faster, some people are slower, some people are smarter, and some people are less so. Everybody's unique. And that uniqueness, I mean, think about it. In the grand scheme of the universe, the fact that you exist at all, first of all, is miraculous. And the fact that your particular brand of you're the only one of you. I mean, you might be a twin, but even your twin's a little different. You're the only one in the entire universe. You're the most precious thing that exists because you're the only one. That's amazing. But that said, that doesn't mean that everything you do and you say is miraculous. And I think one of the problems that we have in our day and age now is we flipped the script in the sense that as a fan, in my day, child, you had to go out. You had to look outside yourself and go find things. You had to be an explorer. And in order to get a book, or in order to go see a movie, or you had to go. You had to take yourself out on an adventure. You know, whether it was taking a few city buses to get to a theater, whether it was wrangling up parents to drive you one way or another, you had to make an effort to just get to your goal of even seeing a film. Now that everything is so easy, you become suddenly, oh yeah, what do you got for me now? And because no one has to make the effort anymore to actually see what they want to see, well, their opinion of it becomes much more elevated, and everybody's thinking about it in terms of how they think. Like, show me what you got. We talked about today, they announced this week, Sony is putting out the movie Krull on 4K disc. Now, if you haven't seen Krull, when Krull was coming out, we would get excited for everything. You know, and in the post-Star Wars age, there was all kinds of fantasy and science fiction movies coming out. Krull is obviously a post-Star Wars film, and it had cool things in it, like everyone knows the glaive. If you've seen Krull, you know what a glaive is. It's one of the great sci-fi weapons of all time, or fantasy weapons of all time. It's just cool. I love the stop-motion crystal spider in it. But Krull, not great. You know, but no one walked out of Krull going, well, that sucked. You know, we were talking about what we liked in it. The glaive was cool, the spider was cool, the big castle was cool, you know, the chick was hot. Whatever it was, our mindset was, what were things about it that we liked? You know, and it didn't matter what we watched. I mean, I remember seeing Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, which I really didn't like very much. Molly Ringwald's big breakthrough performance, and Michael Ironside's in it, and it wasn't very good, and the visual effects are not great, but his character was named the Overdog. And that alone, I'm like, you know, the movie's not good, but I kind of like Michael Ironside, the Overdog. You know, people don't like Chronicles of Riddick very much. I love Chronicles of Riddick. I'd love Chronicles of Riddick if for no other reason than the villains are called necromongers. I mean, that's like one step away from a Quiet Riot album cover. Necromongers. You know, come on. Nowadays, though, unless something tickles your fancy and unless something is like amazing, it has to be a 10 out of 10. It sucked. You know, and I can't, I've talked so long and about looking at things at scale. That's why when you go see The Terminator in 1984, it blew you away. Because you knew you were seeing not a big budget studio movie, but you knew you were seeing a low budget indie movie made by the guy who made Piranha 2: The Spawning but got fired. You know, I knew a little bit about, because I was reading Starlog or whatever, I knew James Cameron worked on Escape from New York and Battle Beyond the Stars and worked for Roger Corman, and went into Terminator thinking, ugh, you knew when you stepped into that theater 5 minutes in to Terminator that you were seeing something special. You knew. But anyway, you say in your letter, your comment, I'm so sick of listening to OG fans who still hang around telling prequel fans and other fans that they are factually wrong for liking the sequels. Here's the thing. I agree with you. I don't think people should say you're wrong. But the thing is, what you need to do is be discerning. And I think that's the problem with the modern age. Everybody focuses on something, and if you know cinematic storytelling, like for instance, if you're a Star Wars fan and you haven't watched Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, Seven Samurai, or even a more modern Kurosawa movie, Ron, for instance, if you have not watched those films, you know less about Star Wars than maybe you should, because that's where a lot of what George Lucas was drawing from. And by the way, knowing those things will make your experience of watching Star Wars richer. The more you know, the better off you'll be. You can appreciate what's going on. And the problem with the prequel trilogies is many people saw those movies, same's true of the Goonies, by the way, before they had learned to be able to discern what actually is the difference between what's good and what's bad. That's why Return of the Jedi was such a huge disappointment for me. Because as a film, I mean, when we used to go watch those 3 movies every New Year's Day at my friend Steve Melching's house, who went to work on Star Wars animated material, when you watch all 3 of those movies in a row, the come down from Empire to Jedi is just enormous. From the way it looked, the way the characters are acting, I mean, but you have to understand, you have to be discerning. And I think the more you know, the more your appreciation will be with fandom. And I think that it's not so much that we OG fans, I mean, we had Star Wars. The Phantom Menace did not come out till 1999. So we all had been watching Star Wars for 22 years. 22 years. That's a long time. And so these movies were burned into our psyches, and we knew what made them good and we knew what made them bad. We'd been reading our Legends novels, we'd been playing the Shadows of the Empire video game, or we'd be playing that first role-playing Star Wars role-playing game, or take your pick. X-Wing fighter, TIE fighter. There was so much Star Wars that had come out in those 22 years that we as fans had an expectation of how characters were shown and displayed. And I'll tell you, another thing is that we'd also never seen things like the Jedi depicted. And I'm of the opinion that one of the biggest problems with Phantom Menace is we'd never seen Jedi at the height of their powers. And the way they're portrayed in Phantom Menace is not cool, it's goofy. What we wanted from Jedi was more Seven Samurai or Ron than goofy kids stuff. And that is a problem. Now, I understand if you've seen the prequel trilogy and they were the first things you saw and you saw them as children, you haven't yet discerned the difference between what makes something good or what makes something bad, so you're going to love them no matter what. And everybody gets very defensive. I understand this. Fan communities are always like, if you don't like what I like, or if you're gonna tell me that something's bad that I love, then I'm gonna take it personally. I understand that, but it didn't necessarily used to be that way. Because I used to get in heated arguments with people as a 12-year-old about Star Trek and The Prisoner and all that, but we all knew we all loved all of this stuff. But I'd have to say that the material that we were arguing about was a little bit more elevated than some of the things that we're getting today. That's why when I watched the trailer for Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 3, I look at something, even the interview or the article that was in IndieWire that I put on Twitter, the review of the first 5 episodes, were exactly what they look like. They're lightweight, frothy. I like to call it the Vegas version of Star Trek that's made for the masses. It's got great production values, but it's pretty empty-headed, and it's really for visitors to come in and see, and look at that, that's so fun, ha ha ha, and then they leave. Strange New Worlds has become more egregious than Discovery in terms of being a disappointment. What a squandering of a great cast. And it's a show that's trying to emulate everything but Star Trek. They don't know how to tell good science fiction tales, but I won't go off on a rant. But anyway, the multi-generational aspects to fandom, especially media fandom, that didn't exist. And when you say OG fans, you're right, because there wasn't very much in terms of media, movies and TV to be fans of until Star Wars and what happened afterwards. There was some things, certainly. There was a lot of really interesting post-apocalyptic 70s science fiction. Look, one of the movies that I would say I loved when I was a kid was Logan's Run, but you look at it now, and as an adult, I can grow up because I'm a discerning human being and understand Logan's Run's not so great. I still love it, but I can also recognize it has a lot of faults. And in terms of going back to first principles, I read the novel Logan's Run, which bears very little resemblance to the movie. Very little. And it was interesting because the 2 books, the sequels that were written after, Logan's World and Logan's Search, they kind of had to take the movie into consideration and adjust expectations, which was interesting in itself. But the first article that I want to read that I've decided, I found this interesting piece. Again, sometimes I'm like, I don't know where I come up with this shit. But this comes from the Journal of Transformative Works. And it's a symposium, Brianna Dim and Casey Feisler. And they wrote this, I don't even know when, but University of Colorado, Boulder. And in the abstract, an exploration of old versus young fandom indicates that this divide is fueled by shifting norms, encouraged by migration across online platforms, with changes that focus on conflicting norms around the publicness of fandom. And although fandom has become more public-facing, fans are also more broadly participating in activism, forming communities for political action and media criticism, causing long-standing fans to worry that these changes could lead to a collapse between private and public spaces. However, what makes fandom important remains intact. Fandom is and will continue to be a home for those pushed to the margins of media. And now let me just start here and just read this real quick. Wandering into the unknown. Fandom is an ever-evolving community of nomads migrating across platforms and constantly attracting new members across generations. With fandom stretching back further than the internet, It's a small marvel that the community has traversed online platforms together while maintaining core values that still persist in the community's ever-evolving spaces. However, while the community has persisted, it's also not immune to change. Over the course of several research studies concerning the relationship of fandom to online platforms, we have heard that many long-standing community members about how fandom and its participants have changed over the years, especially in regards to generational differences. Sometimes these differences reflect shifting norms, for example, related to the increasing publicness of fandom. Migration across online platforms also leads to changing interaction styles and expectations among fans as a result of different technological affordances, such as more or less granular privacy settings. Younger fans have also embraced involvement in advocacy and activism, both within fandom and more broadly. These descriptions of how fandom is changing contribute to a theme we observed. There is a creeping sense among fans that private and public spaces online might be collapsing into one another. Online fandom is a space that is at once both very personal and separate from all things personal, as people bring with them to fandom the parts that might not be welcome in their daily lives, while also leaving behind connections to their real identities. Meanwhile, public platforms, an overall more mainstream interest in fandom, and increased public engagement serves to peel away the layers between fandom and the rest of the world. Our research suggests that these changes are seen in part as reflecting generational differences, with young fandom being more comfortable with new interaction styles and norms. In this essay, we explore the reasons and consequences for these changes, and we ultimately argue that fandom is functioning and will continue to function as it always has, as a safe space for people normally pushed to the margins of popular culture if they want to be themselves. Tongue-in-cheek complaints like, "Kids these days, get off my Elon," are meant in jest, but they speak to legitimate concerns about how fandom might change, particularly coupled with the increasing visibility of fandom and the blending of fandom into mainstream culture. The traditionally private nature of fandom is rooted in long-standing issues such as social stigma or anxiety over copyright law, and even the spreading popularity of geek culture brings with it the danger of segregating remaining outsiders that might not fit easily into this more mainstream node. However, norms around direct interaction between fans and media properties or celebrities are increasingly eroding the line between public and private spaces online. And even the design of platforms themselves is influencing the relationship between fans and industry. This shift is something that newer fans may be accustomed to, while older fans may experience tension with existing secrecy norms. Similarly, normative shifts toward commodification of free culture for other types of user-generated content leak into fandom spaces as well, but may directly conflict with long-standing values of gift culture or further erode the distinction between public and private spaces by requiring real identities for transactional purposes. These lands are unexplored for many people in fandom, but they may be the standard and the starting point of fandom for newcomers. Basically, in a nutshell, the online nature of fandom has changed it irrevocably. Now we can all scream at each other, online anonymously. It used to be, for me as an OG fan, there was no internet, so if I wanted, and my friends, there was nobody that I could have long-time conversations or long-term conversations or extended conversations about Star Trek or Star Wars or bigger things like Star Wars. Kids all wanted to talk about Star Wars, but if I wanted to get into the minutia of the Star Trek blueprints I was looking at, there was nobody to talk to when I was a kid. Nobody. And the amount of time I spent reading things like Bijo Trimble's The Star Trek Concordance and looking at those blueprints, looking at the Franz Joseph technical manual. I mean, if you think about it, one of the interesting things about Star Trek fandom is back in '75 when the blueprints of the Enterprise and the Starfleet technical manual were released. The Starfleet technical manual, if you took the little Star Trek thing out of the front of it, it came in like this vinyl wrapped cardboard cover, but it looked official. It looked like it came from the 23rd century, even though it wasn't even canonical. it was total gobbledygook, that was written, but it had starships in it that seemed plausible. Somebody had gone to a lot of time to create something that seemed real. And as a fan, I was 8 and I got these things. They seemed legit. Like, nobody could tell me that the Star Trek technical manual and the Star Trek blueprints were fake. If you were to tell me those aren't canonical, I'm like, okay, they were a real product that was licensed, that was sold, that said Star Trek on it. You're not going to tell me it's not real, even though nobody sat down with those blueprints and approved them. The blueprints of the Enterprise D that were released, that Mike Akuda and Rick Sternbach worked on, well, because those guys were working on the show itself, they had much more legitimacy than the blueprints of the original Enterprise. Even down to cetacean ops. Yes, there were whales on the Enterprise D. They worked in navigation. Was that canonical? Hey, when those blueprints came out, and of course, Lower Decks brought cetacean ops into the canonical nature of, because we saw it on screen, there's cetacean ops, must be real, there's whales on the Enterprise, which I kind of liked. But, there was nobody to tell me that, oh, that's not canonical or that is canonical. But anyway, the internet and the way people interact now, because fandom has become so ingrained in people's, it's all about, like, I didn't have a problem that I knew enough that the idea of, I was a very social kid. I liked people. Star Trek was all about boldly going in life. I was not in my parents' basement. I was never home. I was a very social kid. I was a very active kid. I wanted to meet girls and kiss them and see boobs. So from a very early age, that's what I was doing, and I was fairly successful at it. So that's what fandom taught me, to boldly go and live life. I was never a basement-dwelling fan. That said, I also wasn't telling people how deep into it I was. I had kind of a group of friends that were fans. I had a few friends we were film fans. We weren't necessarily Star Trek fans or Star Wars fans. We liked that, but we also liked other things, like we'd go to concerts, and we were going out and having adventures and things like that. But for the most part, I was very closeted about how deep into fandom I was. If I had had the internet as a teenager, I don't know if that would have been such a good thing for me, because I might have spent way too much time online talking about Star Trek and Star Wars. Because when AOL, the early 90s, I was on those AOL Star Trek boards all the time. All the time. There was also something called the Hollywood Cafe that if you got in there like after 10 o'clock at night, that's a whole different story. But that was something when I lived in LA. It was definitely a place to be, the Hollywood Cafe. But the internet changed everything, for everybody. But the problem with the internet is you're at home, you're by yourself, you're interacting with people, and you've not ventured anything. You even can do it anonymously, so no one, now people are seeing who you are and all that, but fandom required, when you were younger, to go out and get things meant you had to interact with people. And you met people that knew more about things than you did. And they would see, in my case, because I was so young, I was interacting with people much, much older than I was. Not in a weird way, but they knew how into this stuff I was. And they saw me, people that didn't have kids, but they saw me as a pupil. And I was certainly willing to learn. Please tell me everything you can. I want to know everything that you know that I don't know. And that's not the case now. But there's 2 long articles that I've picked to read tonight. By the way, all 3 of these links, you can go read this whole thing, this academic gobbledygook article that I picked, but I thought it would be something that you might want to hear. But the first article is from Medium, and this was from 5 years ago. I think I wasn't so into Medium back in the day, but I found this article, and it was written by Keith D. Wilson. And I figured it was very pertinent, especially it's probably more pertinent today than it was when it was written. Is Star Trek fandom really divided across generational lines? This project came from interaction in one of the Star Trek groups on Facebook. Someone posted the question as to whether or not generations play a role in our dislike or love of a particular series. I went toe-to-toe with someone with the position that generation would play a role, rather strongly or not, in which Trek people prefer. My thinking was that the first Trek you are exposed to creates the nostalgia that makes it, or series most similar to it, your preferred Trek. The data surprised me in more than one way. My hypothesis was not completely incorrect, but it was not for the reason I anticipated, nor as strongly correlated as I thought it might be. Ultimately, this survey has become a learning curve, and I have a more extensive survey already in the works to be released after Star Trek Picard wraps up in March 2020. And if you would like to be informed when it is open, feel free, blah, blah, blah. I created a Google form asking for the age range based on commonly accepted generational divides as established by Pew Research and others, favorite and least favorite series, first series, and favorite movie. I also asked how many as of this writing, 9 series they had viewed completely at least once. At the time of the poll, Star Trek Picard had only released 2 episodes. I also asked about their favorite movie, if they partake in any other forms of Trek lore, and in what region of the world they watched most of their Trek material. After there were about 150 responses, several people suggested, so I added questions to rate each series and to describe how much of the series they had watched, as well as which series they felt was the best written. The link to the survey was shared on at least 10 social media platforms, both in general areas, private shares, and specialized groups for Star Trek friends. Those platforms included Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Slack, MeWe, Pluspora, Tumblr, Instagram, Tapatalk, and Kuna. The survey was also texted to people both by myself and reportedly by others. However, I did not ask people to report where they had found the link, so I have no true idea of how many people were from each place or where else it might have been shared. The survey was open from February 1 through 4th, 2020, and collected 3,589 responses. I tried to get responses for every generation. However, many of Gen Z are too young for social media still, and many of the silent generation are no longer with us, with the average U.S., where most of the respondents were from, life expectancy is less than 79 years of age, and the youngest of that generation are still at least 73, or they are less likely to be on social media. As an individual, it would be impossible for me not to get super robust data for these 2 generations. It is one of the reasons why I will just ask for your current age on the next more detailed survey. Millennials make up the majority of respondents. However, they are currently the largest living generation that could have taken this online survey, often being dubbed the Echo Boomers. I also tried to control for this by separating the data by generations to see if responses held true among generations. The silent generation is the only generation that does not have at least several hundred respondents. Now here is the age groups and how they answered. So you can see that. I looked at information by generational divisions first. For clarification, 22 is considered Gen Z, 22 through 37 are millennials or Gen Y, 38 to 53 are Gen X or Xers, 54 to 72 are baby boomers or just boomers, and 73 plus is the silent generation, which they were for this survey, as only 4 of this generation were able to respond, which is one of the biggest issues I have with the methodology of this being a mostly online survey, but being an individual pollster, online is all I can manage. First, I looked at each generation's favorite and least favorite series. I anticipated there would be a strong correlation between the First Contact series and the favorite series. This does not seem to be the case at all. So here you go. That's the first series for the silent generation. Remember, there's very few respondents. Here is the silent generation favorite and least favorite. And by the way, Discovery had debuted, but Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks, I don't believe, had at this point. Here's the first series for Boomers. Leave that up for take a look at that. Boomer favorites versus least favorites. So there you go. While 95% of boomers started with the original series, just over a quarter of them prefer it. Meanwhile, Xers were fairly evenly split between TOS and TNG as their point of first contact. However, they prefer DS9 to TOS, though TNG is their most chosen favorite. It has been suggested that perhaps boomers preferring any Star Trek more than the other generations seem to is because, like the silent generation, they remember the nearly 20 years without any new Star Trek series, and a decade with only Star Trek novels being released. I'm not certain this is the reason, but it is a fair inference to make when we continue looking at the data. Now, here's me, first series for Gen X. I started as a kid, but it's obviously 55% and 42% for TNG, and with a very little DS9 and Voyager. Now, here is Gen X's favorite versus least favorite series. So there you go. As millennials come into the Trek universe, they have more variety from which to have first contact than any of the previous 3 generations as a whole. In spite of having a larger number of options, almost all millennials cut their teeth on TNG and find TNG and Deep Space Nine equally wonderful. And so there you go, first series for millennials. And here is the millennial favorites versus least favorites. To be fair, TNG and Deep Space Nine were both on the air at the same time. Well, there was an overlap period. Deep Space Nine went on the air in 1993, and TNG went off the air in 1994. It would be more accurate to say there was more Deep Space Nine and Voyager overlap. To be fair, TNG and Deep Space Nine were both on air at the same time, and I personally remember watching one right after the other on my local channel, but every local station did its own thing, including airing the shows on different nights, since both shows were in first-run syndication and not exclusive to one particular media company's broadcasting repertoire. Now here is the first Star Trek series for Generation Z. Gen Z. And take a look at that. And now here is Gen Z's favorite versus least favorite series. Very interesting. Our final generation, Gen Z, is the youngest of which are only in kindergarten at the time of this article, and the oldest of which are barely fully legal adults, have had every single series available to them on multiple platforms for a significant portion of their life. The first generation to grow up having this privilege. As such, I was personally very surprised that TOS and TNG were their first series. My own Gen Z offspring wouldn't watch anything from before the turn of the millennium until very recently. Even more surprising is that the newer, arguably better CGI quality programming is not their preferred series, but rather TNG and Deep Space Nine still ring in as their undeniable favorites. I wonder why. It seems, no matter the generation, TNG and Deep Space Nine reign supreme as Trek fan favorites. In fact, DS9 overwhelmingly won as the best-written Trek, even though it had only about a third of the favorite series votes. Look at this. Here is the chart for which series do you think is the best written. Pretty definitive. Just over a third, 39.4% of all respondents had watched less than half of all the series at least once. This is not a move to gatekeep who is or isn't a true Trekkie, as a fan of just things with Captain Picard in them are as true of fans as those who love the Kelvin timeline or who have watched every single episode, read every book or graphic novel, or even created podcasts across or about the universe. I only mention this because for some of the further analysis, I only looked at those who had watched 8 or 9 of the series to completion. The reasoning being twofold: to see if someone who has watched all available series has an opinion differing significantly from the general vote, and because they have watched all the series versus 1 or 3, they are able to pick a favorite out of all versus a few. Now here is a chart about how many of the series have you watched completely and at least once. Now, I want to be very clear. As much as I've been critical about modern Star Trek, and when I say critical, I have a burning hatred of certain aspects of modern Star Trek, as you've all been subjected to over the last 6 years, beginning with the Kelvin timeline in 2009. What was even more galling was to listen to director J.J. Abrams talk about how much he hated Star Trek growing up because it was too intellectual. I'm like, why am I? This is what you're doing. When you're tub thumping and you're out there trying to get me to watch your movie, which of course I'm not going to not watch. So when people say to me, "Well, if you like it, when you watch it," because it's Star Trek, because I'm a student of it, I can't not watch it. It's gotten to the point now, though, where I don't have to watch it anymore because I already know why it's mediocre. And now it's gotten to the point where somebody has to tell me it was good. I mean, when Star Trek is paying more attention to everything other than Star Trek, where it's Joss Whedon and Buffy and Angel, and now it looks like modern Star Trek is taking its cues from the USS Callister episodes of Black Mirror and Galaxy Quest, because they don't want to, they just don't want to, the people that are making Star Trek now, especially Strange New Worlds, don't want to be making Star Trek. They would love to take that cast and go make an original show, which is what I wish they did. Why they're trying to make a prequel to the original series, which they've basically abandoned. They'll use the characters because they don't have to. It's much easier to use previously existing characters and just put your own spin on them than to create characters that are your own. It's amazing to me that as much as they keep ripping off the Cage, let's go back to Captain Pike, which they've been doing. All of modern Star Trek has been doing that. You know, you ask yourself, if you're going to do that, where's Dr. Boyce? If you watch The Cage, the most interesting character interactions between crew members is Pike and Dr. Boyce, which is older Dr. Best Friend. And yet, because he's an old white dude, they've just, we're not going to incorporate him. Let's steal characters from other shows instead. Anyway, the thing that I was most interested in seeing was how, let me get this right. With 30.6% of respondents choosing it. I think it is important to note that least favorite does not mean hates. I'm glad you pointed that out. So here's which series is your least favorite? I looked at the data from both those who said they've watched the entire series versus those who have watched at least some of the series. So here's the overall ratings on Discovery. So, terrible, okay, awesome. And this is overall ratings on Discovery, and then these are the Star Trek Discovery ratings. There doesn't seem to be any difference in how much of the series you watched as to whether or not you dislike it. In fact, there is only a 3.1% difference between those who have watched every episode and the whole population of respondents who chose it as their least favorite series. When we look at it on a generational scale, it seems the older generations actually prefer Star Trek Discovery over the younger generations, with Generation Z choosing a rating of terrible about 30% of the time, and Boomers choosing it about 20% of the time. None of the three respondents from the silent generation disliked Discovery. And here are Discovery ratings. So how about the other series? Does being our least favorite mean we think it's terrible? Turns out that seems to be only the case about 50% of the time. So here are the ratings of at least favorite shows. These are the rating of least favorite shows here. These are the ratings. I'm not sure we can conclude anything about Picard based on this data, as if it had only aired 2 episodes when I started and ended my survey. However, the majority of people who chose it as their least favorite for now apparently really do not like what they've seen so far. Gosh, you think? As you can see from the table, however, only 17 people chose Picard as their least favorite show. And here's another chart. Again, no matter how we look at the data, Discovery is still the running for least liked series, though it is only a third or so of Trekkies who seem to feel this way, though they feel strongly, it seems. Ultimately, the majority of Trekkies would likely agree with the adage that any Trek is better than no Trek. I totally disagree with that. While there may be some generational differences, there doesn't seem to be a major generational influence on favorite Star Trek series, and only a minor influence at the extremes for least favorite series. Here are the ratings for least favorite shows. Ah, yes, the movies. We can't seem to make up our minds about which movie is the best. First Contact and The Wrath of Khan seem to be the most loved, with The Voyage Home and The Undiscovered Country in a tie for third. I didn't bother breaking it down by generations because there really does not seem to be a significant difference in which generations love which Trek more. The next poll will let us see if we think Abrams really did butcher the new Trek movies or not. Spoiler alert, he did. Which movie is the best movie? Well, here you go. This original analysis was conducted by Keith and Lysana Wilson. A more in-depth survey with subsequent analysis will be conducted and published soon. I just thought that was an interesting little chart to look at. But look, we now have fandoms that have multiple generations over the course of decades to watch. Doctor Who began in the early 60s. Star Trek began in 66. The James Bond motion picture series began in 1962. You know, and all the things after that happened. Transformers, the animated series, began in the 80s. We've got decades of Transformers series now and movies. And it's a very interesting thing. Star Wars began in 1977. We're 2 years away from its half-century anniversary. What's really interesting to me is Star Wars seems to be, but even now, Star Wars seems to be the first it's sort of immune to when it was made because the whole thing took place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So when you identify yourself as taking place a long time ago, well, then you're in the past anyway, so people are used to it. Kids will go back and watch something like Star Wars, but you ask them to watch another movie from the 70s, you'd be hard-pressed to do it. I ain't gonna watch Jaws. That shark looks fake. And then all the other movies are way over kids' heads, so they won't go back to the 70s. Can't even get them to go watch Herbie the Love Bug movies, or even Dexter Riley movies with Kurt Russell. But anyway, Star Wars. For me, the biggest, which they don't talk about, and you have to ask yourself, first principles. Why was something made in the first place? And the thing is, with all of our IPs and all of these things that people love, it comes down to the fact that before anything was an IP that was really valuable to a corporation, somebody had to take a chance on making it in the first place, and no one knew if it was going to succeed. No one working on the first seasons of Doctor Who would ever tell you that in the year 2025, it would still be being made with a bigger budget than ever before. Who would have known that Star Trek would be turning 60 years old next year? 2026 is the 60th anniversary of Star Trek. When I was a kid, I couldn't believe we were getting Star Trek the Motion Picture. Star Trek the Motion Picture came out a decade after the original series went off the air, and 5 years after the animated series was wrapped up. It was insane. And to think about that for me in my life as a little kid who started watching Star Trek at 5, I got Star Trek in my life from 1972 to 2005. Now, I thought Voyager was a copy of a copy of a copy, but there's some good stuff in Voyager. And then Enterprise, had a long time figuring out what it was going to do, but there's a lot of good episodes. Oh, there's some good episodes in the first 2 seasons. The 3rd season was interesting, but it wasn't really very Star Trek. It was something else. But the 4th season, when Manny Koto came on board and they delved into the history of Star Trek, that was more my jam. But for me, I got Star Trek that I really enjoyed consuming from 1972 to 2005. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's kind of a long time. I mean, if you think about it, movies have only really been around. We have sound film since 1927 on. So if you think about that, from 1927 to from the beginning of the sound age, this is I never thought about this, but if you go back to 1927, you think, okay, that's when sound started to come in to motion pictures. The first season of Star Trek was 66, 67. So from you've gone from what? From 27, it was only 40 years. From the dawn of the sound era of media to when Star Trek was airing was only 40 years. Now, if you go back 40 years today, it was 1985. So Back to the Future. Back to the Future for Star Trek, I mean, that was when sound came in, and then I would be seeing Star Trek now today. That's wild. I mean, if you think about it. It's like you see those things on, this is for Gen Z. If you were in Back to the Future, Marty McFly went from 1985 back to 1955. While if you were doing what Marty McFly did today, you'd go from 2025 to 1995, which is relatively mind-blowing. Because if you think about it, how much has culture changed from 1995 to 2025? I mean, social media has been, but, so, anyway, but to me it's interesting, but to me it's first principles. The problem with our franchises is once they're controlled by corporations, the corporations' interests overshadow the reason the shows are made in the first place. Before, you had passionate creators who wanted to tell certain stories. Gene Roddenberry went from doing Have Gun Will Travel and a cop show like The Lieutenant. He wanted to make a Star Trek show or a science fiction show where he could discuss issues of the day that he couldn't necessarily discuss on TV, but he used a science fiction construct, Wagon Train to the Stars, to do it, the same way that Rod Serling used Twilight Zone. So the reason those two creators wanted to make these shows was to tell original stories and deal with hard-hitting social issues in the context of a fantasy show. It was basically, it began with one guy and a dream. And remember, Star Trek, Twilight Zone ran 5 years. So Twilight Zone, 157 episodes, I think. There's nothing to be ashamed of. They even got to try season 4 was the hour-long episodes. It didn't really work, but it was all right. There's a few good ones. But the thing is, they were made by singular individuals. Well, now the Twilight Zone's a franchise. They're going to make a Ben Stiller's going to make a Twilight Zone movie, which is coming on the heels of other. There's been multiple Twilight Zone TV shows and a Twilight Zone movie. Once something becomes a franchise and it's controlled by a corporation or controlled by a large company, the reason that something gets made is no longer about the story being told. You hope that you have a creator like it looks like Noah Hawley with Alien Earth has done a really interesting job where he's combined the concerns of, say, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and Alien, which makes sense because Alien had artificial people and Blade Runner was about artificial people. So to make an Alien show that's set on Earth that deals with weaponizing biology, and dealing with artificial intelligence, that's a natural. So while a corporation, it's still owned by Fox, it's going to be on Hulu, they allowed a creator like Noah Hawley to come in and bring his sensibility. The man did Legion, which is Legion was an X-Men show. Look what he did with that. Look at Fargo. So you have a real creator that's come in to work on the Alien franchise. That's exciting to me. That's exciting to me because that creator already proved himself to being kind of an intellect. The same's true of Scott Frank. If you haven't watched Department Q on Netflix, he did Godless, and he adapted Walter Tevis's novel and made The Queen's Gambit. So in my mind, Scott Frank is a singular creative entity. Yes, Netflix is making his projects, but he's bringing his unique frankness, literally, Scott frankness, to his output. And even though Godless and The Queen's Gambit and Department Q, which is based, again, it's an adaptation of a I believe is it Norwegian or Swedish? A Swedish franchise, but he's bringing his unique sensibility to it. What you're getting with Scott Frank's material is authorship. Now, look at Doctor Who. I really enjoyed what Russell T Davies was doing with Doctor Who, especially with the 10th Doctor and Torchwood, say, Children of Earth. But his reasons for doing Doctor Who, I think, became corrupted when he's come back to Doctor Who and he decided to inject it. When people have their platforms, they want to think that let's do social activism work and let's overtly inject our own politics into our science fiction shows, which is, to me, so interesting because science fiction itself as a property, you're supposed to do it allegorically. It's an allegory. So by injecting your stories with overt identity politics or overt progressive politics kind of misses the point on what science fiction television used to be so good at, which was science fiction presented you, or to a certain extent horror and fantasy too, science fiction was great at presenting you compelling ideas, but didn't tell you what you should think about them. It presented you compelling dilemmas or milieus, and it said, here you go. Now, they knew what they wanted you to come away with, and that's what a great storyteller does, but they covertly lead you down that direction through a great story and great characters. Nowadays, the storytelling has suffered because it's been completely corrupted by this, we're going to inject politics, and I've decided that I'm me, the creator. I'm going to tell you, you uneducated masses, what you're supposed to think. That is the death of storytelling. You are not doing your job anymore. What you've done is you're now abusing your position, which is unfortunate, and it's made all of our storytelling worse, which is too bad, because all the people that went into it in the first place took the right lessons away from it, but then they were corrupted later. And they weren't necessarily corrupted as much as the storytelling and the work they've been doing is corrupted, which is sad, because it ruins every story that you want to tell. It ruins everything. If you are going to imbue a story with your agenda, and that becomes, you can't lead with that. You always lead with your characters and your story. You know, the story should have whatever message you want to convey baked into it, and you have to lead the audience down a path, but you can't tell them what path it is that you're leading them down. The story has to do that. It has to be self-evident. So, anyway, I think one of the problems with modern audiences, especially younger audiences, is they're getting a lot more garbage storytelling than we got. Because Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back were transformative. That's why when Tony Gilroy comes along and decides, you know, it's really interesting. There's been a lot of controversy, if you've been following online, about Star Wars Theory. Star Wars Theory is a pundit. He makes his own lightsabers. He's made a great Star Wars fan film. Actually, 2, I guess. And I like Star Wars Theories. You know, he's a perfectly nice guy. But his controversial take on the fact that, they should never have shown any kind of assault in Star Wars, that Vader wouldn't put up with it, that Tarkin wouldn't put up with it, or whatever. He's been getting roasted online. But I understand where he's coming from, because, you know, he came to the universe, say, later, or he was younger than I was, for instance. But when you're dealing with, look, a lot of fans don't want to delve into what a rebellion is, because suddenly the story that you're telling becomes much more complex, and it becomes much more reliant on a knowledge of history. And Tony Gilroy said right away, Star Wars is at its core a story of rebellion. It's not just people saying, but Rob, it's a fairy tale. Yeah, it can be just a fairy tale. If that's all you want to do with it, that's true. But you know, what Tony Gilroy has done with the 2 seasons of Andor, 24 episodes of TV, and Rogue One, because he came in, 24 episodes of TV and a movie. The man told an incredibly fulfilling and illuminating story that, even though it took him 2 years to finish it up, he's been working on it for a long time, so it's not like it's supposed to be a direct reflection of today. But the fact that people think it's a direct reflection of what's going on in the world today shows what great writing and what Tony Gilroy was trying to do was tell a universal story about rebellion and empires, a rise and fall, and what happens to ordinary people. And it's happened throughout history, over and over and over and over again. And the thing about Andor is, like I have always said, the best fiction is the most truthful. And as far as I'm concerned, Andor shines above all. And that's why people love it. But Star Wars Theory didn't appreciate that there were certain very controversial and very uncomfortable, and let's face it, icky things that happened in that series that were not something that he was experiencing with Star Wars. And I get it. I get it. I totally understand. And his vehement dislike of it, or trying to say, I don't think he should have been roasted. You know, I disagreed with his take, but I understand where he was coming from. So, anyway, by the way, 1001 Johnny sent in a super chat. I went off the air before I read his super chat. He sent me a link, which I can get to. Dr. Beat has become a member of the channel. Thanks, Dr. Beat. 1001 Johnny says, this is the kind of appeal Snyder's depictions have with their audience. Whoever that generation might be, the grit of Superman through Man of Steel to Zack Snyder's Justice League is resonant. You know what? You know what I did today? I kid you not. It was so effing hot in here. I was going to do work, so I kid you not. I went upstairs, and our air conditioning's broken in our house right now, at least one half of the house. So I was just sitting there drinking more and more water, and I watched Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice and half of Zack Snyder's Justice League. And I did today. And while, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, it's all very epic, and I really did enjoy watching it, but I haven't changed my opinion. Those movies are cool, and they have a great tone to them, but oh my God, are they dour and oppressive. And as much as I really enjoy them, I really do, because they're fucking metal and all of that, they do not have joy in them. They just don't. And I understand why people resonate, how people love those things and how they've created this cult around them. And I really enjoyed watching them. I mean, I really appreciated it. They're very epic. It's epic fantasy storytelling. But you're still dealing with superheroes. And you know what you never feel? When you say the word superhero, you never feel that word in those movies. And Superman, as much as I like Henry Cavill, there's not a lot of him in them. You never get a sense of the character of Superman. He's always, it's something. My favorite scene of Henry Cavill's in all three of Zack Snyder's movies is when he gets in the swimming pool with Lois. And that's after she's almost died in Africa. It's like she's feeling trauma. And he gets in the bathtub with her. So Douglas Burton says, so 1001 Johnny, I know where you're coming from, and I know you I mean, those movies in a way, they're almost liturgical. You can think it's almost like going to church. I feel like I'm watching some kind of a weird superhero Catholic mass when you watch those movies. There's definitely something holy and biblical in those films. But I mean, they're oppressive. And watching them again today, I still feel that way. Douglas A. Burton says, every generation's different. I'm fascinated to learn how different generations see things differently in pop culture and why. But it's silly to act like any one generation is a dominant one. I agree. Every generation's different. The problem is, a lot of the things that people love today came out of, two generations. And what is interesting is the generations that have followed have not made as many things, especially in music, have not made as many things that are as resonant. And the question is why? Why is that? And I think the reason is because, especially Gen Z, they've become a generation of consumers. Whereas, millennials went out and created companies, software companies, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. 1001 Johnny says, this isn't a very fair summation of the letter writer's point. He isn't calling the prequels 10 out of 10. He said he liked them and doesn't appreciate being told they're bad. Are old adventure serials also bad? No. I don't think... look, you want to watch a great superhero adventure serial? Watch the original Adventures of Captain Marvel. I don't think they're bad at all. The filmmaking was there. I mean, they might not have the sophisticated special effects, but they had great storytelling, and it was the writing. I think the problem with the prequel trilogy is that George Lucas lost touch with humanity. The problem with the prequel trilogy is there isn't one exchange between human characters in those three movies that feel at all authentic. Until you get to the end and Obi-Wan and Anakin are shouting at each other because they're supposed to be in a fight. Do you believe it's this boy? I mean, those movies even make Sam Jackson seem stilted and wooden. And it's because it was all about the technology, and George Lucas, I think, had lost touch with mankind. He couldn't go out of the house and enjoy himself anymore. He was too insulated from the world. Joe Panora says, the first Bond movie I saw in theaters was The Living Daylights. It inspired me to go back and watch the previous films, which is great. And you'll probably find, The Living Daylights was good, but you'll find, I think, some of the earlier Bond films you might think were better. Botagonist? Oh, Botagonist. I see that. That's good. I'm 53. And I forgive all the bad shows except Mando seasons 1 and 2 and sequels that Kathleen Kennedy greenlit because we got the godfather of Star Wars, Andor. which will be talked about for years and years. Yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. It will be talked about for years and years because we'll probably be talking about Andor in 50 years the same way people talk about The Godfather. Totally. Attack Story. That's a cool name. Stop Making Sense. I love your calm energy. Oh, here I thought you were going to talk about the Talking Heads. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. The Scavengers Elite official YouTube channel has become a member of this channel. Well, thank you. The Scavengers Elite official YouTube channel. I love that. Attack Story goes on to ask, why are we doing shows about Pike? You know what? I don't know. It's really interesting to me because I think that, you know what it is? I think when you go back and you watch The Cage, the reason that they didn't want to move forward with it, like NBC says, the conventional wisdom is that people said it was too cerebral, which it very well might be. But I think that's the appeal of it, is Captain Pike, you know, he seems very thoughtful. You know, he's lost some crew members when we meet him. He's not in the best place. He has his best friend, Dr. Boyce, come talk to him, bring him a martini, you know, and he's like, I'm over it, man. And then, you know why I think? Because Pike is all about trauma, and trauma is the name of the game. You know, we've been with the Trauma Olympics for the last 20 years. Everyone, let's talk about our trauma. Everyone's made personal trauma the story du jour. Because again, you're looking inward. Why don't I feel good all the time? Everybody wants to talk about their trauma. Trauma. And I think that was the appeal of Pike, and that he ultimately ends up in a wheelchair in a very traumatic situation. That's my belief. I think modern writers, and I think Strange New Worlds, they're always attracted to trauma. That's become a thing. And the problem with trauma is, you know, your personal trauma does not necessarily make for great action, adventure, allegorical science fiction shows. But that's what people want to write about. So maybe that's why they're doing Pike. That's just an idea. Brett Dean says, how is saying Star Trek too intellectual anything other than saying you're not intelligent enough to handle life's big concepts? I agree. Dream. Wonder. It's a greater big universe out there. Amen. Norwegian Kryptonian says, my Exo 6 TOS Cage Mr. Spock is in the mail. How excited are you? What a great figure. I guess mine is too. Can't wait. And I can't wait to get that Gorn. I love Exo 6 figures, but I have to say, now I'm hoping that, and I love Exo 6. I have every figure they've put out except Saru and Burnham. I'm just not going to buy those figures. And in those Discovery uniforms, no fucking way. But I have to say, that Pike head sculpt on the prototype, it's got to be better than what's in those pictures, because that head sculpt is not good. So I hope the Pike is better. Jordan Sellers, who's been a member for 26 months, says, I can't believe that there seems to be a discussion about should Superman have trunks or not. It's crazy to me. Of course he should. It's his classic costume. Snyder did a lot of damage to DC. Maybe so. Major Chai Chai said, it's weird. I don't know why the trunks. I mean, it's such a weird thing. People are like, they got rid of the trunks in the new 52. I like Henry Cavill's Superman costume. I like the new 52 high thing. I mean, I'm going to wait to see. I will say this. As I've seen more and more action figures of the new Superman, I really like the suit because it looks like a classic Superman suit. I had more action figures in my life that look like that Superman than look like Henry Cavill's Superman, or that look like Brandon Routh. So, yeah. Major Chai Chai sent a Burnettwork gift membership, and so did Tom Jr. Jackson. So thanks for sending those out and getting people to be new members. Brett Dean says, imagine how much better the world would be right now if we had writing that could ask questions or be as honorable as the lessons of the Corbomite maneuver or Measure of a Man and the Drumhead. Brett, you and I park our shuttlecraft in the same shuttle bay, my friend. I mean, that's to me, that's Star Trek. Measure of a Man, well, there it sits. The Corbomite maneuver, you know, Mr. Bailey. And of course, the Drumhead. That's how it begins. I mean, these are profound episodes. By the way, you go back and you watch if you have, and I always say this only because I worked on it, I was responsible for it. The Measure of a Man that's on the Blu-ray, the Star Trek, you can get the Picard, the full box set that has all the Picard. It has the entire Next Generation series, all the movies, and Star Trek Picard Season 3. If you get the Blu-rays that we all worked at, Roger Lay and I worked on, you can see the extended version of Measure of a Man. It's 13 minutes longer. It's amazing. It's the only extended Star Trek episode that exists, and we were able to get it done, and it's pretty amazing. Roger sent 5 Burnettwork gift memberships in. Thank you for that, Roger. And Captain Robert April has been a member for 34 months. 1001 Johnny says, let's go! Batman v Superman. It is pretty epic. Major Chai Chai said, I would have loved to watch a Star Trek series in the vein of the 1960s TV show Combat. Well, that's what they're saying, that the new this new Star Trek The Beginning Origins movie, whatever, it's supposed to be of the Romulan War. So, yeah. Joe Panora says, any updates on the Skydance acquisition of Paramount? I don't have any. I don't know. Don't know. I've been looking out for that. I don't know. 1001 Johnny says, no Trunks was Jim Lee in 2011, not Snyder in 2013. Yeah, it was the New 52. The New 52 is when he lost the Trunks. Darth Plato says, attention, Rob Shuttle Bay is now at maximum capacity. Park elsewhere, please. That's funny. There's some tips. Let me go down to the tips and see what people have to say there. By the way, I have one more article to read, and it's about Star Wars, not Star Trek. And first of all, we've got 1001 Johnny says, I can appreciate this sentiment about Yoda, but I can't agree that this is entirely true. Any child who is familiar with myths would understand who Yoda was almost immediately, and adults would be savvy too. I speak from my own experiences from other films. Of course. I mean, you know that he's a mentor, but the way they play it, you know, you're supposed to be, it's supposed to be a misdirect. It's not a very long misdirect, but it's definitely supposed to be a misdirect. And that was great. The thing is, that's a great moment when Yoda changes and he shakes his head. It's a great moment. Why would you want to lose that? The prequel trilogies kill it. I mean, look, do I love it when Yoda comes walking out and uses his lightsaber? Yeah. Even though the whirling dervish thing was weird. I kind of feel that I really wish that we'd seen something else. Laser Bobby Jr. says, hey, Pops, I want to wish you a happy Father's Day. I'm proud to have you as my father. Well, thank you, son. That really means a lot. Wishing me a happy Father's Day brings me more joy than being wished a happy birthday. Well, I didn't know I've had a child out of wedlock, and apparently he has a small penis, and he has other things that go on that, you know, he's informed us about in the past. So it's nice to have a son. I'm glad to be your father. I hope I've inspired you and forced you to become more of a cunning linguist. 1001 Johnny says, I might suggest people look up Christopher Lee and his experience with the prequels as well as Natalie Portman. You'd be surprised how well their own imagination filled in the green screen in their minds. Oh, that's true. I got to interview Christopher Lee about that myself. Peter says, I remember when they just made a movie in the 90s, and today they make content and franchises. Nothing can be just a movie unless it's going to be more than a movie. Forrest Gump was a great movie, but it was one epic movie, and it ended, and it stands alone. I agree. I'm glad they didn't make Return to Shawshank Prison. And that was another thing. That was the paradigm of movies. Movies would give you this 90-minute to 2.5-hour experience, and it would be singular, and it would be standalone. I mean, my favorite movies of all time we were talking about it today on Let's Get Physical Media with Max Allan Collins. Chinatown's one of my favorite movies. You know, I love movies like Chinatown or L.A. Confidential. You know, these mid-century or early mid-century L.A. cop movies. They stand alone and they're amazing. Kenneth Colton says, Batman Begins celebrates its 20th anniversary today. I didn't know that. It's still my all-time favorite Batman film. Sending my hot, sweaty man love to you, Bob. Well, you know what? It's always nice to get some hot, sweaty man love, if you know what I'm saying. And I think you do. That's what I'm saying. I'll be a switch. Yeah, you know, Batman Begins, we saw it. I was working 20 years ago this month. I was working in Sydney, Australia on Superman Returns, documenting Superman Returns. So we probably went and saw, I don't know if we got a special screening of it, but that's where I saw it, was with the crew of Superman Returns. Now, I have another article. This, I think you guys are going to like this. Oh, wait, 1001 Johnny says, I meant by other films is the Goofy Frog is an old kung fu master who doesn't give a damn and messes with his young pupil to test his attitude and resolve before revealing his identity. Yes, and that was definitely a trope, hence the links, the Star Wars links to Asian cinema, which are definitely a big part of Star Wars. So this one, you guys are going to like this one. This one is called, Krashak. This is from July 7th, 2021. Star Wars. Now remember, this was written in 2021, so it's 4 years old. Almost 4 years old, July 7th. July 7th was my sister's. No, July 7th was my father's birthday. There is a saying, and Krashak, where is this from? This is from Krashak.com. There is a saying, no one hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans. I have found that sentiment to be unarguably correct, but I have spoken to many people who find themselves confused by this. Detractors exist in all fandoms, but I have yet to see a fandom as passionately divided as Star Wars can get. I believe the answer is buried in the core of what made Star Wars work in the first place. I'd like everyone to take a minute and think about the very first Star Wars movie. Don't call it A New Hope, but you're going to call it A New Hope. A New Hope came out in 1977. No, just Star Wars came out in 1977. And back then, it wasn't even called that. Oh, okay. It was simply Star Wars. Now ask yourself, what genre was this movie? Not a list of genres it included, but a singular genre to describe the movie. No matter what you said, there are millions of fans who think you are wrong. This is because George Lucas and his team did something amazing with that first movie. He successfully blended several different genres into a single coherent story. There was gritty realism side by side with idealistic fantasy. There were clear, direct inspirations from samurai films and westerns, two closely related genres, but there was also shot-for-shot recreations of hyper-realistic, based on a true story war movies. There were large-scale conflicts with stakes on a galactic scale, but also personal conflicts that didn't matter much beyond the individuals involved. There was esoteric mysticism, but it also explained hard sci-fi. There were tightly choreographed action scenes, but also boardrooms of old men discussing detailed politics. There was light comedy, and also heavy emotional topics. It could appeal to children, but also to adults with no children to speak of. Balancing all of these things was a difficult proposition. There have been many other stories that try and hit as many notes in the same work that failed in that task. Following Star Wars as an inspiration, many other writers have tried to mix genres to the same extent, but few have done it successfully. Even then, the successful examples that I can think of still don't hit quite as many different genres as Star Wars does. It was why the movie was able to pull in such a large crowd. Almost everyone who went to see the movie walked away getting something they wanted out of it. The next two movies followed much the same pattern. They expanded on many elements and even brought in new ones, but largely didn't deviate from the path set by the first movie. The whole trilogy maintained a consistent tone. However, once the third movie was over, the franchise faced a problem. There was a clear audience for more content, but Lucas didn't feel like he had the right content for another movie trilogy ready. So the story continued through other media. Small budget movies, books, comics, video games, etc. Almost every format you could put a story in carried the Star Wars name. Whether consciously or subconsciously, writers started to realize something. These quieter forms of media didn't need the same kind of viewership as a movie to be successful, so many of them began to be written in a way to be more targeted to their audience. I think that's a really important point, actually. Slowly, the Star Wars fandom began to diverge. People who were excited by certain aspects of the franchise would seek out material that focused on those aspects, while other people would be doing the same thing with other aspects. This worked perfectly fine when it was a different group of people quietly reading different books. This balance was shaken when work began on new movies. The first signs of trouble happened when the special edition version of the original trilogy was released. For the most part, it was simply a special effects upgrade. However, there is one moment in particular that got a lot of flack. Han shooting Greedo. In the original version, Han shot first. This was done as a clear reference to classic Western scenes. For those coming in from the perspective of interest in that genre, the scene solidified Han as a calm and practical man. It made him seem hard but not immoral. For those coming from a direction of Star Wars being a family-friendly movie, it made him, and George Lucas felt this way, it made him seem overly violent. The thing is, when George Lucas was making Star Wars, he didn't feel that way. That's something that after 22 years he'd contemplated when he decided, no, you know what? I was making a kids franchise. He didn't understand. George Lucas is still perplexed by the Star Wars success. He still thinks he was making movies for kids. So a change was made to have Greedo shoot first and Han retaliate. To the family-friendly crowd, this was a subtle change that softened the edges of the character slightly, but didn't majorly change the scene. To Western fans, it undermined the character and completely changed the scene, to the extent that many called the whole movie ruined for that one change. I would say I don't think the whole movie's ruined, but I think that is a complete misreading. Making Han shoot first was that's all I need to know about George Lucas tampering with his creation. Because what it did was it fundamentally changed the character of Han Solo, because the whole point of that scene is that Greedo is threatening his life over my dead body. That's the idea. Well, Han Solo has to take him at his word. If someone tells you in the real world that they're coming to kill you, say a country tells another country they're coming to destroy that country, you got to take them at their word. You can't sit there and wait. And when Han pulls his blaster out from under the table and kills Greedo, one, it was a very satisfying moment, not because Han is suddenly a cold-blooded, bloodthirsty murderer. It's because his life has been threatened, and he does not hesitate to get the drop on Greedo. He's also in a vulnerable position, and he has a gun pointed right at him. And like this writer says, by not having Han shoot first, you diminish Han as a character. You make him weak. You make him not nearly... I mean, having Greedo fire first and making Han just get lucky that he didn't get shot, you can't make somebody at close quarters... Another problem with that scene is it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable Greedo would miss. And they've been changing it since 1997. It was a terrible change because it fundamentally changes the character of Han Solo for the worse. And you can never get away from it. This was only an early example of the genre shifting to better appeal to one group, only to find it made the story worse for another group. The reaction was subtle compared to the reaction to the prequel trilogy. Here, major shifts were made to the entire tone of the story that solidified a rift in the fan base. Why is that happening? That has never been mended. The prequels shifted largely away from mysticism and heavier into sci-fi. A particular example was there being a blood scan that could tell how powerful someone was in the Force by measuring midichlorians. For people coming from a more sci-fi direction, this was a tiny bit of world-building fluff that could easily be forgotten but helped to set the scene for the tech level. For people coming from a more fantasy and mysticism side, this undermined the entire concept of the Force. By bringing scientific understanding to the Force, the magic of uncertainty was removed. I would go even further. One of the problems by saying that you could inherit being Force sensitive removes the idea that the Force surrounds us and binds us. The point is that every single person could tap into the Force. And Andor actually brought it back when you saw that Force healer. That person might not have been a Jedi and might not have been as strong as the Force as, say, Darth Vader or Luke or Anakin. Or Anakin and Darth Vader are the same person. That was a bad example. Obi-Wan. By saying it's inherited, you've diminished the idea of a person being able to become adept in the Force through training, which is really ludicrous. And I think that was the thing that was very undermining to the movie. The prequels also got larger and flashier with action scenes. For fans of the action genre, this just brought some more fun and spectacle. For those who were fans of a more down-to-earth political struggle, it was distractingly flashy. Well, look, I would say that as much as you like things like... everyone likes a good lightsaber duel. But when you have to set up a lightsaber duel when people are standing across from each other to the point where they take their clothes off, I'm going to say, let me take my cloak off. Which, by the way... Another thing about Star Wars that really bugged the fuck out of me, if I may, the reason Obi-Wan Kenobi dressed like that was because he lived in a desert environment. The idea that all Jedi wore those thick robes is silly and ridiculous. Their underclothes were neat, but their cloaks, which were, very samurai-esque, but Jedi cloaks were so silly, and when they take them off, it means that no one really thought this through. And I think that's the problem. One of the more famous points of divisiveness is the character of Jar Jar. He was clearly intended as comic relief to appeal to kids, and he was successful at that. Many children thought he was hilarious and wanted more of him, but to those expecting a more serious adult movie, he was completely out of place. I will say that personally, as a child watching him, I was amused. As an adult rewatching the movies, I find him aggravating. Well, the thing about Jar Jar is you don't believe him. Star Wars went such a long way toward making you believe in that universe. To create a character like Jar Jar that is completely reliant on earthbound humor in a galaxy far, far away. One of the really interesting things about the humor in the original Star Wars and what worked about it was, like when Han Solo is effectively ribbing Luke and says, I don't know, do you think a princess and a guy like... No. Everyone understood that. It was situational humor. You understood the idea of playful ribbing, but you also understood the idea of jealousy. Han knows that Luke is smitten with Leia, even though they don't know their brother and sister yet. And so he's giving him a hard time. We, the audience, all understood that. But when you start making puerile fart jokes and stepping in bantha poodoo, even those words sound like they're for kids. It shattered the illusion, or it shattered the verisimilitude of the universe. And that's why people hated it. They hated that character because they didn't believe in that character. And I'll tell you something interesting. Chris Gore actually gave me the script to The Phantom Menace months before the movie came out. And he wrote, he sent me a hard copy. He gave me a hard copy and he said, put on the Star Wars soundtrack and when you sit down and read this. And I have to tell you, when I read the script for Phantom Menace months before the movie had come out, I loved the script. I loved it. And I loved it because the way in my mind I was seeing it as Star Wars Empire and Jedi. I did not hear Jar Jar Binks going, Lisa, think this was... That was not how he read on the page. And I never would have read him that way because why would a Star Wars character sound like that? The thing about Star Wars is it already pushed the envelope. If you think about how A New Hope opens, it opens with 3PO and R2-D2. R2-D2 just beeps and boops. But you know what he's saying. And they convey emotions of an astromech droid through the way he sounds. And the fact that Luke just can understand him. And when you meet C-3PO, who's like this prim and proper, he's this fey waiter robot. That when he says, his voice might have been funny, but the first thing he says, did you hear that? They've shut down the main, there'll be no escape for the princess this time. What does he say? Did you hear that? They've shut down the main reactor. There'll be no escape for the princess this time. Which is telling you that although C-3PO sounds funny, he sounds like a British, hello, like a snooty, like the guy in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You're Abe Froman. But what he's saying is important. He understands it. Did you hear that? They've shut down the main... C-3PO knows so much about the Rebel blockade runner, he can tell that the reactor's been shut down. And he comments, they've shut down the main reactor. Will be destroyed for sure. There'll be no escape for the princess this time. He's doom-saying, but he's also showing that he's smart. And it's like, I'm going to follow this guy. And even though it's Laurel and Hardy, it's the characters from the Hidden Fortress, they're not dumb. And they're not just there for comedy relief. You know, and C-3PO, when he's, well, I'm not going that way. You know, he's making, it's easier to go this way. That way is much too rocky. He's being pragmatic. It's not humor for humor's sake. It's actually character-based humor. It's funny that a robot is going, I don't want to walk through the rocks. And that's great character building. Whereas Jar Jar Binks, his voice immediately destroyed any credibility he had as a character. At least in my mind. A more nuanced issue was the concept of a strong female character. Leia was for the most part a damsel in distress for the first movie, but she did show a fair amount of grit and decisiveness. She was never a damsel in distress. I disagree with you there, because Leia from the very beginning was, what does she do? She gets the plans into R2, she takes out a stormtrooper, she gets in Vader's face, she gets in Governor Tarkin's face, and remember, you don't see it, but I would say to Star Wars theory, it's implied that Leia is pretty heavily tortured. I mean, when you see the droid come in with the big needle, that ain't going to be pleasant. Padme was clearly written with the intent... You know what? I don't agree. I don't agree with this article. I didn't read this article before I read it. But anyway, when it came time for Disney to make the Star Wars sequel trilogy, they remembered all of these complaints and so tried to swing the pendulum in the opposite direction. What they failed to understand was that for every complaint one group had, there was another group that was either indifferent or even liked the element. So as Disney backed away from previous complaints, they only drew new ones. I've previously covered my personal complaints about the sequels in detail. What I would like to emphasize is that there was one particular thing that really got to me. You see, before Disney owned Star Wars, there was a low amount of quality control going into the various entries to the stories in various mediums outside of the main movies. Some of it was correctly described as low quality, others complained about confusing inconsistencies. Disney heard these complaints and decided to wipe the canon. They made it so that only the movies were officially the story and that the new material would be added by them. The moment they did this, I was hesitant but optimistic. They were in a similar boat to where they were with Marvel when they acquired it. I've loved what they've done with the MCU. Even if they have changed around stuff to make their stories more consistent, they still regularly draw from the older material for content. I was hoping to see a similar thing with Star Wars, but that's not what happened. While some minor elements are taken here and there, for the most part, instead of doing a live-action interpretation of the Star Wars that existed, they have made their own. Here I find I've run into a fan-based distinction I was previously unaware even existed. Much like other genre shifts I've discussed, while I sit in a group of people angry that their favorite elements of the franchise are being ignored as if they never existed, there's a large group of people for whom nothing outside of the movies ever really happened. To them, no matter what Disney made, it would have been fresh material. And this is where you see things like people calling Rey the first female Force-sensitive protagonist in the franchise, while longtime fans of other mediums can point to dozens of other characters. It's a disconnect that is difficult to reconcile. For decades, different groups of people who all call themselves Star Wars fans have been consuming different parts of the franchise. The fandom has ceased to be a single entity and is instead about 15 different fandoms stacked in a trench coat. I did notice that after the backlash that Disney got from The Force Awakens, they had tried to course correct and swing the pendulum back the other way for the next movie. However, this came off as tonally inconsistent with the previous movie and only served to piss off the people who had previously been appeased without really appeasing the people who had been pissed off. This left no one happy. When it came to the third movie, no one was happy going in, and I think the story had backed itself into such a corner that there was no way to make people happy coming out. So, no one was happy with it. So anyway, this article started good, but I'm sorry, I don't think it ended well. I don't think it was as insightful. I probably shouldn't have read it, but I read it anyway, so here you go. Look, I think the thing about, like, Star Wars fans is, again, when people saw Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, I know because I was one of them, when it first came out, no one had ever seen anything like it before. And remember, George Lucas did not direct The Empire Strikes Back. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even there through a lot of the filming of that movie. And he wasn't a fan of what happened with it. And I think that people always say that Star Wars was made, I know a lot of people always say to me, well, it was made in the edit. Well, I would say, yeah, every movie is. I mean, what happened was Star Wars wasn't working, and you had a lot of really talented people in a number of disciplines come together and make it work. Because they'd never done a lot of that stuff before. And I think that George Lucas's sensibility is such that he wanted to make... Star Wars was not the movie that he wanted to make. Star Wars was the result. It was it was the result of what happened when he and his collaborators set out to make a movie under his direction. But I don't think that Star Wars was the movie he wanted to make. And I think that Empire Strikes Back was less of the kind of movie he wanted to make. And Return of the Jedi is a course correction into more of George Lucas land, which is why I'm not nearly as satisfied with Return of the Jedi, and I consider it the most disappointing movie I've ever seen in my life, because it didn't lean into the believability of what I had watched and fallen in love with. But I think generationally, if you've never seen Star Wars before and your first foray into it, and why wouldn't it be, is The Phantom Menace, as a kid, I completely understand if I had seen Star Wars. I mean, The Phantom Menace is a movie you watch at 4, at 5, at 6, because you get it. You know, it's a movie that you can watch, and it's so eye-popping. It's different. I mean, a lot of people, I've heard people tell me that the original Star Wars is boring. Because, you know, you think about the first half of that movie is people talking, kind of wandering around and establishing the universe. But if you've already seen Phantom Menace and you've already seen Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, then you get to Star Wars. It's a really big change of pace. That's why I find it amazing that Lucas used the episode. Remember, when Star Wars came out, it was not Episode 4, A New Hope. That was put on when Empire Strikes Back came out, and they made Empire Strikes Back Episode 5. I think that was another decision that was made at the time that no one really thought through, because if they wanted to do something like that, they could have called it something else, because Episodes 1, 2, and 3, calling them 1, 2, and 3, now you have to watch them that way. I think the original trilogy is severely diminished. I mean, people talk about the machete order, like you watch Star Wars and Empire, and then you go back and you forget Phantom Menace, but you watch Attack of the Clones, and then you watch Revenge of the Sith, and then you go back and watch Return of the Jedi. Or I guess now you could watch Andor. I mean, not for kids, but you could now watch Andor Seasons 1 and 2, Rogue One, Star Wars, Empire, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, and then Jedi. But, you know, this is the thing. I will say this, from a generational standpoint. Star Wars and Empire was peak Star Wars. Everything else has been lesser than. Everything. Andor is the first time I felt I watched something new and different. I really liked Rogue One. I thought it could have gone a lot further, and I don't think Rogue One ties very well into Star Wars. It's really weird. After you watch everything that's set up in Andor and you watched Rogue One, it's like, why are they going to Tatooine? They have the plans. They never mentioned Ben Kenobi. It's not like, well, we have to go get Ben Kenobi. No, here's the thing. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I always felt that in Star Wars, Tatooine was just where they wound up. They came out of hyperspace. They were damaged. Who knows what's going to happen? But they were on their way to Tatooine. That was the destination. Leia's ship fell under attack wherever it was, and they figured, if we can, you know what, if I can get to Tatooine and I can get this to General Kenobi, if they capture me, I can be the distraction. I'll tell them the rebel base is on Dantooine. I get these plans to him, and he can get them to the rebels. I trust him to do that. But when you watch Rogue One, there's no reason why they go to Tatooine. There's no reason. I'm like, wait, why? You're going through hyperspace, and why are you going to Tatooine? Why would you want to lead the Empire to the location of a former Jedi? Why would you want to do that? The answer is you wouldn't. You wouldn't want to do that. You're not only leading the Empire to a former Jedi, you're leading an Empire to Darth Vader's son. Your brother. But I guess you didn't know that, although I think she probably does. But that was a dumb move. So Rogue One, I don't buy the tie-in. But other than that, it hits harder when you watch Andor Seasons 1 and 2. Anyway. But generationally, look, the problem is, if you weren't there at first principles, and you're getting... I'm not saying that things aren't getting better. I mean, Superman mythology grew and was made better over time. And most people think they don't realize that Superman didn't leap, he leapt tall buildings at a single bound when he was first created. He didn't fly. But I think it's important for fandom, from a generational perspective, if I say something on this show, it's not because I want to alienate my younger viewers. It's because my experience, I was there. You know, I was there. I have an older half brother, and I remember once he was at our house, and I was probably 12, and I was going through. I'd seen Apocalypse Now, and the Apocalypse Now led me to the Doors, and The End is on their first album, and I became a huge Doors fan, and it was also that was also the time I had a paper route, and I had like my first Walkman. And so I was making tapes. I was only listening to Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Who, and the Doors. You know, I was going through that phase. I was that kid at that particular time. And I loved the Doors. I thought the Doors were really cinematic. Alive She Cried. What a great record. I love Moonlight Drive and that, and Gloria. So good. Anyway, I'm off track. Kevin Rubio says, franchise IPs are not new. The 30s gave us Tarzan movies, the 40s gave us Andy Hardy and the Thin Man, and the 50s gave us Peyton Place. Absolutely. We were talking about the 47th Precinct movies today on Let's Get Physical Media. I do think, though, Kevin Rubio, who made Troops, now everybody's making Stormtrooper movies. They're ripping off Kevin Rubio. So go watch the original Troops on YouTube. He did not use AI. He went out to Death Valley and shot it out there. But Kevin, you should use Google's new AI, and you should make the Tag and Bink movie, man. Darren says, Brooklyn Park MN here. Crazy days. Thank you for tonight, Rob. Yeah, Darren, it's some crazy Minnesota, man. You guys, ooh boy. What is going on? Zachary Zabali says, I've always had aspirations of making something disruptive, but I can't code. Yeah, I mean, hell, man, you can go make a feature film. I mean, it's expensive, but you can go make a feature film with Google's new AI, and people are doing. I mean, look at those ape videos that are flooding social media. Somebody should just you get like 120 or 110 shots. You know, you could go make your feature. You could absolutely go make a feature film now. I feel like, you know, if you want to spend the money on I feel like doing that. And Peter says, I already read that one. I'm already caught up on tips. I think I'm going to end this show, everybody. I think it's time. Or, yes, what is with people choking me off? I mean, it's not like I even want them to choke me off. They're just choking me off here. Anyway, I'm going to end this show. What do you think about generational fandom? How is that? Comment down below. Tell me what you want me to talk about. Oh, you know what? That's what I remembered. I have a letter to read. You know what? I'm not going to... I don't want to forget this because I want to end with this. This is a great letter. I'm not going to go out. I'm not going to go quite yet. Let me read this letter. It's in response. This letter is in response to the show I did about awe and wonder. I think this is a great way to end this. This comes to me from James Murphy. And James Murphy writes, Hi, Rob. You asked for a real story, a moment of true wonder. Not from a film, not from a scene, but something lived. It took me a while to figure out how to say this properly because my version of wonder isn't shiny or poetic. It's about surviving, breaking down, and then somehow finding joy in the most unexpected place. So here's mine. When people talk about wonder, they usually mean stars, sunsets, or spiritual awakenings. For me, it came after nearly dying and then standing half naked in a gay club. I've lived with Crohn's disease most of my life. Not the manageable kind, the kind that owns you. Every year, like clockwork, I'd have a serious flare-up. My intestines would swell, bleed, and twist themselves into agony. I lost count of how many transfusions I had as a teenager. I was in a hospital so often it felt like home. drugs, constant monitoring, tubes in my arms. It never really stopped. It just paused between storms. Then, during the pandemic, everything changed. I had the worst attack of my life. My bowel perforated. It ripped open inside me. The surgeon looked me in the eye and said, "We need to operate right now. No build-up, no options, no time." I didn't even argue. I was too weak. But in my head I thought, fine, let me die on this hill. I've had enough. But I didn't die. I woke up missing a part of myself. My intestines were gone. I now had a stoma bag, permanent. It wasn't temporary or reversible. It was the kind of line no one talks about crossing until you are already on the other side. The physical recovery was brutal, but the real hell came after. Shame, fear, and a wave of social anxiety that made me feel like the world no longer had space for me. I didn't want to be seen, especially not as a gay man. I was already big. Now I had a bag. In my head, gay spaces were for twinks, gym lads, and polished people. Not me. But after months of healing physically and mentally, I said, no more hiding. I visited a friend in Manchester who lives next to Canal Street, right by the gay village. He said, "Come out with me." And this time, I did. We went to a body-positive gay club. I expected judgment. I expected to shrink into a corner and survive the night. What I found instead was freedom. Men of all shapes, all sizes, jocks, harnesses, bellies, scars, some older than me, some younger, some shirtless, some nearly naked. One guy had a walking stick and danced like it was the last night on earth. Another had a chest bigger than mine and didn't give a single damn. And no one stared and no one judged. They just welcomed. That night, I didn't feel broken. I didn't feel like a medical case. It felt like me. I laughed, I danced, I talked to strangers. I belonged. And yes, I had one unexpected perk. I didn't have to queue for the toilet. Having a stoma bag meant I could use the accessible thanks to my radar key, a nationwide pass from my stoma nurse. Honestly, best club hack I've ever had. I don't know if we have that in America. But that wasn't the real joy. The real joy was this. I was alive. I'd come through hell, and there I was, in a dark room full of lights and bass and half-naked joy. Living. Not surviving, but living. That night didn't give me a miracle. It gave me something rarer. It gave me wonder. Not in some grand, scripted Hollywood way, but in the quiet, chest-deep realization that after everything, I still had moments like this ahead of me. That I could still feel joy. That I could still find connection. That I could still step into a place I thought wasn't for me and feel wanted. That's what wonder is. Not magic, not destiny, not stars. It's waking up after you thought you were done and discovering there's still beauty left in your story. All the best, James Murphy. You know, if nothing else, it's letters like this that make doing YouTube worthwhile. I feel so privileged when people teach or want to share or just tell me something I hadn't heard or didn't know. What a profound story, and I want to thank you for sharing it. I think it's time to bring up, you might appreciate this, I have a friend named James Cole, and he was born with serious birth defects, and he has alostomy bags where what they have to do is he was born without a large intestine, so they rewired his insides, and he has what you were talking about. He has part of his smaller intestine protrudes outside of his body, and he has an olostomy bag on it. And with him, he had a bag that collects both his urine and his feces externally. And instead of going to the bathroom, he changes his bags. Now, as you can imagine, to live your life this way is very, very difficult. And I've known Jim for a long time. And he just wrote a book about his experiences. He was in and out of the hospital for years as a kid. But he wrote a book. It's available on Amazon called Not a Whole Boy by James Cole. And I would recommend, if you want a story of perseverance, I would recommend going to Amazon and getting that book and supporting Jim. And just like the story we just heard, I can't imagine the things that we take for granted. But what a great story. If you have tales whenever you felt awe or wonder in your life, I'd love to hear them. Send them to me right down there. And just put Robservations in the subject headline. And then if you want to tell me a subtitle of what it is you're interested in, I will read it on the air. I want to thank you for that. What an incredible story to share with us. So thanks very much. And I want to thank you all for being here, all of you imagination connoisseurs. I want to thank all of the people that support this channel through super chats and tips. I want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson and all the moderators. I do have a Darth Plato letter I'll probably be reading tomorrow that's very interesting about protesting that I want to get to. And I hope everybody had a great Father's Day. And remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I say to everybody, have a better night.